Seriously? You're making another video talking about RWBY? Don't you think you're pushing this a bit too far? So, since my last video on the subject was okay, I guess, there were two major things that caught my attention. The first being that apparently I offended so many people with my audio. And secondly, a good number of people were surprised that I made a reference to a tokusatsu show called Kamen Rider GAIM and the Inves. So, you know what I thought I'd go with?
Shut up, fool! Stop your jibber jabber! The T-Man is here!
I figure I'd make a video or two making comparison between RWBY and Kamen Rider GAIM. Why, you may ask? Because I know it'll make the RWBY fans mad that I dare consider something to be better than RWBY. Or because I want to make a legit comparison of the two series. Side note, if you're the kind of guy who thinks that I'm being completely serious there, that I'm intentionally trying to piss off the RWBY fan base, well, you're just a sad human being, then. Both series premiered in the same year, both involve fighting monsters, have elements of oppression, have a focus on fighting within them, with unique weapons, and etc, etc. Considering the two have varying plots, it's important to establish the plots for both series and work from there. With RWBY, we're in the fictional world known as Remnant, a world filled with various creatures ranging from humans, regular animals, human with animalistic traits and like tails called the Faunus, and the Grimm. The Grimm are some of the main dangers of the world as they are creatures that attack humans and what they create. Humans fought against the Grimm for survival using an element called dust, and eventually a job known as the Huntsman came to be.
Hunt, 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 he's the huntsman. Into action is his cry. From the forest to the city.
No, not that kind of huntsman. And thus we're introduced to Ruby Rose, a young woman with a scythe who's trained to become a huntress, along with her older half-sister, Yang Xiaolong, who is described to be the big sister of the group, who is very optimistic and a popular character in the world of Remnant, if you believe the commentary tracks on the DVDs. I don't. Why Schnee, an heiress to the Schnee Dust Company, who was described initially to be a self-centered and obnoxious girl who grows to be a more caring person.
Now comes the part where we throw our heads back and laugh. Ready?
Ready!
And finally, Blake Belladonna, the quiet book lover of the group who happens to be a Faunus that plays an important aspect in her character. Yes, this is a very bare-bones description. Since I'm aiming to keep this video relatively passable in time, I have to do so. And I'll do the same with Kamen Rider GAIM. Welcome to Zawaname City, a fictional city in an alternate universe to our own, where the Yggdrasil Corporation turned the once small town into a bustling city that surrounds Yggdrasil Tower. There's a trend in the town where a good number of youth of the city join together to become various dance crews, known as the Beat Riders, and to instill joy into the citizens who watch them dance. However, mixed with the Beat Riders dancing, a mysterious game known as the Inves game, basically a more realistic version of Pokemon, has arrived and mixed with the dancers. They even have the equivalent to Pokeballs known as Lock Seeds that are used to summon the Inves. One day, after the Beat Rider team, Team GAIM, loses to Team Baron in an Inves game, the leader Yuya invites Kazurabu Kota, a former member of Team GAIM, to look at something. That something is the Sengoku driver. By putting a lock seed in the driver, the first person who puts on the driver can transform the wearer into a rider. And a mystery surrounding Yggdrasil, the lock seeds, and the Inves immediately wraps around Kota and the rest of the cast. Other notable characters include Kaito Kumon, who was the leader of Team Baron and becomes Kamen Rider Banana. Right, Baron. Mitsuzane Michi. Kurashima is a fellow member of Team GAIM who becomes Kamen Rider Ryugen. Mai, another member of Team GAIM, who's a stand-in leader for the dance team and actively tries to encourage Kota to do the right thing and support him. And finally, Takatora Kurashima, Michi's older brother and a high-ranking member of Yggdrasil, as well as Kamen Rider Zangatsu. There are other characters in both series, but as I said, I'm trying to keep this manageable, so if I bring up another character, I'll be sure to talk about them in detail when the time comes. Much like the villains though, because there'll actually be quite a bit of overlap between the theming with the villains in both series. I'm also being bare bones for those who haven't seen either series in full because I will be talking spoilers in both, and I want to get to that there. So consider this to be a bit of a warning, but whatever. So here are a few things that both plots hold that are extremely similar. One example would be the themes that we see in both shows. One such would be of coming of age, or maturing as it were, as well as getting over yourself. In the case of GAIM, we see this in Kota, and in fact we see him struggling to do this. At first, when he gets a Sengoku driver, he thinks that the power will give him, and the fact that he can transform with it, is that he can become a better man.
この缶持って上がってきてくれ。はい。よし。
Unfortunately, he doesn't. But throughout the series, Kota gets challenged by outside beliefs. He questions his own convictions, and considers what he needs to do, even if it is to sacrifice himself in some manner to save his friends and comrades. And in RWBY, probably one of the best examples comes from Yang, after she lost her arm and had to learn how to become more considerate about her fighting style and trying to mature from her previous personality. Hell, these two characters even go through depressive spells, for different reasons of course, with Yang losing her arm and Kota, coming to terms for killing someone close to him. Wait, what? And there are a lot more elements I can go into, but I'd like to get to the actual points as to why you should watch Kamen Rider GAIM instead of RWBY. Now, I'm sure the more keen-eared of you have noticed that I compared the main lead of one show to the secondary lead of the other. And you may be wondering why. Well...
Me?
One would especially consider the name, the fact that she's the leader of Team RWBY. Hell, RWBY is practically the titular character, and she was shown in the first episode with the first action scene. One would easily assume that she's the main character, yet for a good portion of the series, she really doesn't get that much development. She's practically a static character in her own story. We do see characters getting development, and there was actually a slight amount of development in Volume 5 for her, learning how to fight with her fists and not how to use her silver eyes power. Compared to other characters, RWBY has little to no development as a character in her own right, even though there was a lot of potential to be had, with Torchwick, one of the recurring villains that RWBY had multiple encounters with, and seeing the guy before her die, and then seeing Pyrrha die, something that would have a direct impact on RWBY's personality. Except we don't. When we get to Volume 4, RWBY doesn't seem to show off a lot of major changes to her personality. In fact, most of the growth due to the events in Volume 3 goes to Jean. We see him have a lot more reaction and actually growing more in Volume 4, which would be good if he were the main character. I guess that's a pitfall of having a self-insert character in the official product. And to be fair, I do like Jean. I just think the writing for him is poor and he might be in the wrong story since we're supposed to be, you know, following the growth of Team RWBY. It seems as though RWBY is a side character in her own show. That isn't to say that growth for a secondary character isn't important. It is. Seeing Jean actually kick himself down a lot and actually try to improve himself, Jean is essentially more of a typical shonen protagonist. I'm not saying there isn't any growth for RWBY in the last 2 volumes. There is. I've admitted to it. But it really seems like the focus is pushed away from her and onto Jean. Now to be fair, in Volume 6, we do get a bit more development for RWBY, like her actually learning how to use her silver eyes. Took long enough. But there's also quite a few issues, like her using this logic right here.
Bigger people than you have tried to stop us and failed. But we're supposed to be on the same side.
We're supposed to use our power to protect people. But you just use yours to look down on everyone.
We didn't want to steal from you. We did it because you gave us no other choice.
Basically to steal a ship from the Atlas military base because there are bigger things happening. Essentially doing what Osmond was demonized for by the group up to this point in this volume. So, in contrast, Kazuraba Kota does question himself. Going back to what I mentioned before in this segment, Kota does learn the first invest that he killed in the first episode was actually a mutated human. And we see it break him. We see it shake his convictions, and he questions if what he's doing is truly the right decision to save the city that he's been protecting up to this point in the story. It also goes against what Kota had been preaching to save people without sacrifice. Yet he did just that. He sacrificed another person's life in order to protect himself. And yet he did just that, to save himself and his friends. He had to sacrifice someone else's life. The reason why I compare the two is that Torchwick essentially did the same thing in Volume 3 to RWBY. He challenged her beliefs. And his death was a cruel irony that realistically should have shaken her since he actually was in the right in his speech. But we don't see anything come from that.
RWBY ain't all that when she doesn't have her weapon.
And at least with Kota, we see him struggling to tell his friend Mai about the situation, since part of the reason why he fought the mutated human was to protect her. Throw in the fact that earlier in the series, Kota sees someone transform into an invest before his eyes, and even killed before him. And because of this, and searching within himself with a little push, Kota grows, especially when he learns that there's another way to save the city and possibly the world that wouldn't sacrifice anyone. And we see a physical change in him too, as he gains a new power to challenge the world of sacrifice, becoming stronger, and probably getting one of the funkiest weapons in all of Kamen Rider, the DJ gun! And yes, it's exactly what you think it is. I should also point out that the gun can also be converted into a sword, thus giving more of a reason to compare the two series, but the point is, we see Kota grow not only in character, but in actual strength, taking shots as if they were raindrops on his armor. I'm not going to say that Kota isn't the deepest character in Kamen Rider or fiction, but at the very least we see his character grow, and if he was a puddle, if you stepped in him, you'd at least get your ankles wet. He's challenged, and actually have those challenges be reflected in his character. And if I could say about Kota, he too holds the same elements of a shonen main character, a regular guy who comes into power and becomes stronger. I'm sure someone can make a case against this as well, since I do have a bit of a bias. And if you do, consider making your own video discussing this topic. But let's suppose for the sake of pleasing that one guy who acts like an entitled, let me point this out. For 5 volumes, RWBY barely changed throughout the series, and it took until Volume 6 for us to finally see proper development as a character. Don't get me wrong, it's a breath of fresh air, but in Volume 6 it's all crammed in there, especially with the final act of the volume. There's an argument to be made that RWBY's development in the first 2 acts of Volume 6 is good, and hey, I'll agree to that. Questioning Ozpin and wanting the truth, her standing up against the apathy-afflicted friends while trying to keep her optimism, her taking charge as a real leader, and her trying to figure out how to get to Atlas. The problem here is, though, because we're just getting this now, highlighted by the fact that RWBY goes on a lot of speeches throughout the tail end of the volume, it's crammed into the show, cause from where I'm standing, it took 5 volumes to get her development, at least properly as a character. In contrast to Kamen Rider GAIM with Kota again, we do get development throughout the show. Chalk it up with the formats of both shows, with RWBY being more focused on volumes, with GAIM having a single year-long run, but in contrast, one of the major factors in Kota's development of a character comes from the interactions with Takatora, at first being completely wiped out by the more skilled writer, then seeing the cruelness of the adult world being channeled through Takatora, and finally when Takatora is removed from the show and someone else dons his rider gear to impersonate him, Kota is left to question himself and see Takatora as a wall that he needs to get over. And this happens over the course of several episodes. RWBY did manage to come off better in Volume 6, but the tail end is where it becomes way too much. Like, there's a thing called hero speeches, but there's way too many done by RWBY. I will say that both series have their good supporting casts, although I'd like to point out that GAIM's tend to be a bit more complex, and we do see there being consequences for their actions and having challenging ideals to each other. And yet, they can put that aside to actually work together and show that when the writers combine, they can be a force that can be reckoned with. And it doesn't hurt that there's a lot of good chemistry with the characters that can be extremely entertaining. For example, take Kota's interactions with a character named Oren Pierre Alfonso, a French pièce who used to be ex-military, who is actually quite a threat to the beat writers, since he has experience in fighting and it shows. In addition, the reason why there's a disconnect between Kota and Oren is because Oren wouldn't hire Kota because Kota is an Aquarius. And when Oren gets his hand on a Sengoku driver and becomes Kamen Rider Bravo, the two lock heads whenever they're near each other, with Oren usually being the aggressive one, and eventually it becomes a bit more comical with the two's chemistry. It's really entertaining too. That isn't to say there isn't that kind of character interaction involved in RWBY. We do see a lot of interactions between teammates, but there isn't really a dynamic between the main cast and an antagonist. And it's not like there wasn't any potential for a character dynamic like that to be in RWBY. Heck, despite me not liking the tournament portion of Volume 3, it could have opened up the potential for there sort of being a dynamic with the opposing teams from different regions. I get that the tournament, at least according to people in my comments section, wasn't the main focus, but there were things called subplots, and possibly having minor antagonists team up to help defend against the Grim would have been a much more interesting character dynamic. Of course, this leads into another character-driven segment. You read the subtitle, the antagonists in RWBY suck. Well, they mostly suck. The only ones that don't really are Torchwick and Neo, and one of them doesn't even talk! Torchwick is a charismatic villain, and despite his appearance, he knows how to actually fight and has really good teamwork with Neo against RWBY, which, if you ask me, is one of the better fight scenes in RWBY altogether. He's that kind of criminal with a silver tongue, but isn't afraid of getting his hands dirty, except if it dirties his suit. Yeah, I like Roman, however there is a character in GAIM who has a similar role. Heck, he even wears a similar attire. Heck, he wears a similar outfit. Sid. Sid is a lock seed dealer in Kamen Rider GAIM, and he's the guy who basically gets the riders set on their paths by giving them the power that they have access to. He's also a con man in the same vein, and like Roman and RWBY, he works for one of the major antagonists in the series, in this case Yggdrasil, in order to test out the Sengoku drivers. Sid to me is what I imagine Torchwick would become if Torchwick wasn't killed in Volume 3, because while Torchwick says that he's a gambling man, he knows what bets to not take. If he had the same opportunity as Sid did in GAIM, I could see him take that gamble. So what is that opportunity? Well, I don't want to spoil that just yet. Now, this isn't me trying to say that Roman or Sid are better than the other. Heck, they both meet a fate of dying while trying to enact their plans. It's more of a reason to compare the two series. Then there's Cinder. Throughout the first few volumes, she is depicted as a schemer, a puppet master of sorts in order to enact her plans, manipulating the tournament in order to, well, I don't think I need to say anymore.
That guy's dead.
And in the 5th volume, she has that egotism and is rather a one-dimensional character. Evil for the sake of being evil. Now, that isn't to say that one-dimensional characters are a completely bad thing. Heck, take one of the most iconic villains in anime history, Dio. I've seen arguments that he's also rather one-note, but the difference between Cinder and Dio is that Dio plays that one note masterfully, and strongly believes in what he does. What helps is that Dio truly believes in what he does and has a lot of intensity to him that makes the character compelling. Cinder, unfortunately, doesn't have that. Aren't you supposed to be comparing RWBY with GAIM? Why are you talking about JoJo? Because shut up! GAIM does have quite a few characters who do have the scheming motif, to the point where it might as well be its own theme in the show. And I could bring up a lot of different characters in this segment in comparison, but for the sake of time, I'll be only bringing up one. Sengoku Ryoma.
What is your deal?
Being the only character with the wildest hairstyles in the show, as well as it being a more anime look hairstyle, which FYI I didn't think was possible to look that good in real life without it being like an emo prick. Well, I mean, Ryoma's still a prick, but he's an entertaining prick. He's also responsible for a large portion of the plot, and if you can put two and two together and not get fish, then you probably realize that he's the man behind the Sengoku drivers. As a scientist, Ryoma's shown to be a character who's intelligent, and as such, he'll manipulate anyone he can in order to further his goals, even to the point he'll use characters as test subjects to test his inventions. Heck, that's kind of the whole force behind the main characters getting the Sengoku drivers. They're all guinea pigs. And the same thing that I mentioned about Dio, only to a different extent. While Ryoma is a bit one-note with him focusing on his research, the passion he has for that is almost endearing because how he can actually back up his ego he has for his inventions. After all, he can back up his words. He's not a good fighter, but not in the way you may think. He just can't hold back. And unlike Cinder, while Ryoma gloats during the fight, he backs it up, because he knows for a fact that other riders can't beat him, because he made their equipment. They're relying on his genius. Heck, the riders that use the more updated Genesis drivers, which may pose a threat to him in some regard, he actually took the initiative and made a kill switch to the other Genesis drivers to make sure there wouldn't be a chance that he'd be matched in power. Both Ryoma and Cinder are characters who have plans in place to have their goals fulfilled, and are both manipulators who work in the background, essentially puppet masters. However, when it comes to having a better plan that's tighter, it would have to be Ryoma. As I've demonstrated already, Ryoma knows how to play the field and even make sure that anything can go wrong is already covered, for the most part. Like for example, take the whole ending part of Volume 3. When RWBY sees Emerald and Mercury. Because we had this scene right here.
I heard Mercury and his team rush back to Haven to be with his family. So, until they land, no one can really question him about what happened.
So, naturally, if anyone saw any of those team members there, that would raise a red flag. That's the reason why RWBY goes in the maintenance hall in the first place, right? To get to there? I mean, why would there be anything like that said? And even the main character knew about it, especially if you need to have Emerald there to pull off the plan. But what were they planning on doing to make sure their plan worked if it didn't have Penny in it? I mean, I'm sure I'm missing something, but what was their plan? Doesn't matter. The point is, the villains in RWBY, well, they suck. Other than Torchwick, they all feel like stereotypes who are evil for the sake of evil. And we don't really know their motives. Well, most of them. The two that we do know are Torchwick, and he's dead, and Hazel, whose motive is dumb. He wants to get revenge on Ozpin for the death of his sister. Fine motivation, but why does he have to be with a group that is actively trying to harm the world and kill potentially many other people in the process to get revenge? Heck, I'd laugh my ass off if it turns out Hazel's sister died because of a Grimm, because that would be so ironic. Honestly, in GAIM, the characters are a lot more complex, and actually have their motives explained. Takatora wants to save the world with Yggdrasil, but is aware that he has to make sacrifices to do so. Sid wants to gain power because he's tired of being treated as a lapdog. And Ryoma? Well, he's fascinated by what the plot offers and wants to prove that his science and inventions are what make the world work. Honestly, chuck out the guy being finished if you want, and I'll agree that it's a bit unfair, but RWBY has about 5 volumes to give us details about the villains. Instead of being one of the longest running villains, they don't do anything with her backstory before they decide to kill her. Oh, for the love of... Why won't you just stay... Unfortunately, my legal team has informed me that I must be fair again, especially since in Volume 6 we do get backstory for Salem. Too bad it turns out she's a crazy lady with a really big complex and ego that makes me just want to go...
Ooh, nasty.
But I actually want to make it a separate video talking about the villains in RWBY and compare them to other villains in media, so for now I'll move on, and I'll save that for later.
But Carmen, why are you even making this a point? Clearly one is animated and the other is live action. Why are you even comparing the two?
I'm well aware that talking about this is weird. However, my reasoning to talking about both comes to the following reasons. Both series involve unique weapons, a focus of said weapons, revolve around combat, and both require a lot of effort to make the action scenes work, whether it be animation or live action, with the masks that have a limitation on visibility. I'm not discounting the amount of work that both series have to them. However, it should be noted that the action of both series should be compared since there's a focus on the action in both shows, and have a focus on weapons. Besides, GAIM also has animated fights in them. They are actually combined animation with live action, and to RWBY's credit, there are several fights that can be considered stunning, and really fun to watch. From Volume 3, we have the Crow vs. Winter fight, Sun vs. Ilya, RWBY vs. Torchwick, and Neo are some that I can name off the top of my head while I write this. And I'm sure that there will be people who will tell me that more fights that they like in the comments. Now, since I'm assuming that a majority of you watching this haven't seen Kamen Rider GAIM and have more than likely watched RWBY, so allow me to point out a few notable fights, with the fights against Baron vs. Ryugen and GAIM, where the fight starts off with Kaito, Kamen Rider Baron, showing his ability to adapt to fighting other riders by being skilled enough to control the invest during the battle. It's one of the earlier fights in the series, but it shows some creative thinking to gain advantage in fights. Another notable example is when Kota and Kaito fight against the strong wild invest, one that's easily able to take their normal attacks, so the two change their weapons to be more blunt force weaponry in lieu of their normal sword and spear weapons not being effective. It shows adaptation between the two, and we can see the two working in tandem with each other, showing that they're capable of overcoming obstacles if they actually work together. But probably one of my favorite fights in the series involves Kota when he has access to the Kachidoki arms for the first time, just showing the sheer power of him tanking the attack from the opposition flying around, and hell, kicking ass just using his flags. I mean, check this scene out! The choreography and the use of CGI just makes the scene all the more jaw-droppingly beautiful! There is one more fight I need to mention, and it's probably the best fight in the entire series, but I'm a little hesitant since it's the final fight between Kota and Kaito. I saw this since this goes into spoiler territory of the two's final clash. So if you want to skip this part, I'll put a timestamp on the screen so you can skip to there. Okay, gonna talk about it. Not my fault if you don't listen to me. Now. So at this point in the series, the two have obviously different ideologies on what they consider to be strength, and what they consider the strength they've acquired to be used for. Kaito wants to destroy the current world to make a world where the weak can't be oppressed by the strong, and he's not wrong. He's seen through his life that the strong can do horrible things, while Kota believes that the world can still be saved, as there are those who are strong and kind at the same time. And at this point in the series, they both have a cursed power to them. However, the fight itself is amazing, not only with the choreography, as well as having the invest fighting each other in the background, but the fact that the two use everything they have access to in order to fight each other. The regular weapons, to motorcycles, to flying vehicles, to even the invest themselves. And to top off the majesty of the fight, the song playing in the background, in the first half of it, Ranbu Escalation, is actually sung by both the actors of Kota and Kaito, adding an additional flair to the fight when you learn about that fact. And it's appropriate that one of the most climactic fights has the most production value on it, and they definitely did a good job with it. Now, both series have their own styles of performing fight scenes, and I'm not gonna lie, RWBY definitely has more of an edge when it comes to fights. and that's due to the obvious fact that it's computer generated. However, that's a double-edged sword in that regard, and that's been apparent in the last couple of volumes of RWBY, as characters will teleport around the arena that they're in or do things that are completely weird to do. There's this one guy, Floof something or another, yeah, I'm just making a joke on your name, who's been doing videos called RWBY is Broken. I referenced his vids in my previous RWBY video, but I'm giving another shout out to him because he managed to cover a ton of issues in RWBY's fights. From characters teleporting over the place, to the characters just standing around during fights, or things like this.
It's official. You suck.
It's at least worth a watch, so I'll link in the description. But you can see the problem here, right? With RWBY, especially in the most recent volumes, the fight scenes have breaking continuity where the characters are, and what they're doing. If they aren't teleporting around, the characters are just standing around like they're statues. GAIM doesn't really have that problem. Unless you're a civilian, the characters always tend to be moving on screen, unless there's an actual reason why they can't move, or it involves a fight that doesn't concern them. In fact, there's actually something really smart that I have to point out. Since it's a common complaint and spoof that usually crops up with shows that do transformation sequences, things like Power Rangers or Sailor Moon have been criticized with the long transformation sequences, and people will often ask, do the enemies not attack while the characters transform? Well, in GAIM, someone actually takes advantage of that, quite literally shooting Koda in the back as he changes his armor. And in recent time, the transformations like Kamen Rider and Super Sentai have made transformation sequences more instantaneous, or in some points, actually having it be used as an attack or defensive manner that would prevent enemies from getting close or act as a shield from attacks. However, the point is that someone actually took advantage of a clear weakness in the writers, showing that there is some actual strategy being made. Heck, one of the things that RWBY seems to denote is in the team fighting. I mean, that's why we've got the whole team motif going on, but a good amount of time where RWBY fights with team battles, there really isn't a lot of good teamwork within them. I mean, if I can look towards the group fight at the end of Volume 5, the only characters that really team up to fight are Ren and Nora, and that's pretty much a copy and paste from the opening. Most of the other fights are just one-on-one and are pretty dumb. I mean, take Weiss vs. Finale, with Weiss constantly trying to summon, but it's too slow to actually access and she keeps getting hit. Why waste time summoning, especially with an opponent who's fast with a long-range weapon? Yeah, it could be a powerful thing to have, but it wouldn't be useful due to the fact that it's really slow to get it going. It breaks the logic of the fight and leaves you tilting your head as to why Weiss would waste time focusing on a technique that won't adequately be effective, especially with previous volumes. Her glyphs would be a much better choice to focus on in this fight. The fight scenes at the tail end of the volume, basically the fight with Cordovan and the giant grim Leviathan, they are less than stellar. I'm not going to talk about the Adam versus Yang and Blake fight since, well, for one, it's a bit recycled since it's actually from Monty's old work, and for the fact I want to talk about it in a separate video. But the fight with Cordovan, well, one of the major factors that we learn about the giant robot, it's supposed to be slow and bulky, and yet, I mean, just looking at the design of the thing, it shouldn't be able to move that fast. What, did Dio suddenly show up? Oh, and how about this scene? Apparently, Nora's been inflicted with the paralysis status. And I could spend hours upon hours complaining about these issues, but this is probably being a nightmare to edit already. Sorry, editor. So I'll save more points for another one of these videos later. But yeah, this is one of 2 or 3 videos that I've wanted to work on. Next time, which will probably be a few months, we'll be talking about the big bads, the monsters, and the lore of both of the worlds. Not necessarily in that order. I'm Mangakamen, and remember to examine your fandom.